John Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming theory is a positivist control theory of restorative justice that focuses on the rehabilitation of offenders through reconciliation with their victims and their community. Braithwaite's theory has its roots in the social control theory. Social control's foundation is in the 18th century theories of Emile Durkheim. John Braithwaite was born in 1951 in Ipswich, Suffolk, England. He is a criminologist and distinguished professor at the Australian National University. In 1989, Braithwaite wrote Crime, Shame, and Reintegration, an in-depth book that explores the ways in which societies with low crime rates address criminal justice. Braithwaite's reintegrated shaming theory is influenced by the restorative nature of Asian policing and educational practices, and the restorative nature of socialization in westernized families that succeed in raising law-abiding children. These are both examples of what he calls communitarian societies. His theory is also influenced by the belief that the justice system will improve when it facilitates the active participation of families in determining the penalty for a crime as an alternative to punishment by the state. For example, Braithwaite notes that Japan is a developed society which relies heavily on reintegrative shaming as an alternative to humiliating or outcasting criminals. It is the only nation where the evidence shows a sustained decline in the crime rate over the past 50 years. Japan also has a low imprisonment rate, only 37 in 100,000, compared to over 700 in 100,000 in the United States. So while in 2013 the US represented only 4.4% of the world's population, it housed 22% of the world's prisoners. Japanese schools also use reintegrative methods for controlling delinquency that are very similar to the restorative justice conferences advocated in Braithwaite's writings. Braithwaite argues that current criminal justice practices in the West tend to stigmatize the offender, making the problem worse. Braithwaite contends that, quote, restorative justice enables both offenders and citizens by way of mediation to repair the social harm caused by crime. Braithwaite also believes that it is not the shame of the authorities or media that is most able to get through to us. It is the shame in the eyes of those we respect and trust. With reintegrative shaming, Braithwaite gives these three objectives priority over punishment: restoring the victims, restoring the offenders, and restoring communities. Braithwaite also states that it is possible to inflict a feeling of shame for a crime that increases crime when the result of that shame is stigmatization. In a publication for the Australian National University on shame and crime, he writes, quote, reintegrative shaming communicates disapproval within a continuum of respect for the offender. The offender is treated as a good person who has done a bad deed. Stigmatization is disrespectful shaming. The offender is treated as a bad person. Stigmatization is unforgiving. The offender is left with the stigma permanently, whereas reintegrative shaming is forgiving. Societies that are forgiving and respectful while taking crime seriously have lower crime rates. Societies that degrade and humiliate criminals have higher crime rates, end quote. Braithwaite believes that a restorative justice process is more effective than retributive practices. Rather than social exclusion or isolation, reintegrative shaming focuses on forgiveness, apology, and repentance. It works by appealing to a person's conscience and building a relationship of respect and approval where the offender can be restored. The core tenets of the reintegrative shaming theory, as outlined by John Braithwaite, are that tolerance of crime makes things worse. Stigmatization, or the disrespectful outcasting and shaming of the criminal, makes crime worse still. And reintegrative shaming, or disapproval of the act within a continuum of respect for the offender, with disapproval terminated by rituals of forgiveness, prevent crime. A UK criminologist sums up these tenets as, quote, the best expression of positive shaming understands that the deed and the doer are not one and the same. There is a recognized difference between condemning what someone did and condemning the person, end quote. In other words, love the sinner, hate the sin. An excellent example of the reintegrative shaming theory at work is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings that began in 1996 in South Africa following the end of apartheid. The goal of the hearings was to provide a public platform for victims of the crimes and human rights abuses committed by the white authorities toward Black South Africans. These hearings were essential for recording these atrocities so that the victims could begin the healing process and so that their society could bear witness to them with the goal of never repeating them. In some cases, amnesty was granted to the perpetrators of the crimes, and reparations and rehabilitation were implemented for the victims. While there is no consensus on the success or failure of these hearings, one thing is evident. There can be real healing benefits in using restorative justice practices for the perpetrators, their victims, and their society. Critics argue that Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming theory fails to address the societal causes of crime, or to explain why only certain people are identified as offenders and subsequently processed through the justice system. By focusing on the individual offender, responsibility for the choice to commit a crime is put entirely on them, and society gets a pass, as it were. Therefore, if the social and structural causes of those crimes remain unaddressed, repeat offenses are likely to occur. And without improvements in social, economic, and educational policies and conditions for marginalized communities, shaming may not be deterrent enough to outweigh the benefits of committing a crime. I do not believe that Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming theory would be effective for all instances of criminal behavior in the U.S. I do, however, believe it can provide a blueprint for creating criminal and legal policies and procedures that could break the cycle of repeated criminal offenses and lower our crime and incarceration rates. Thank you.